Good afternoon. Namaskar. A hearty welcome to all of you present in the second session of the national webinar being organized by the Department of Political Science, GC College Silchar, in collaboration with the IQAC of the college. I am Dr. Shorupa Bhattacharya, Head Department of Political Science, GC College Silchar, and the convener of this webinar series. The, the topic of the webinar is Migration in Northeast India, Context and Implications. This session is going to be a very vibrant one because we have amidst us Dr. Binayak Datta. Namaskar, sir. A hearty welcome to you. Dr.
Namaskar.
Dr. Datta, an eminent academician from Nehu Shillong, who is an expert in the field of partition and migration of this region, migration of populace in this region. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Datta, and a warm welcome again to Padma Shri Patricia Mukhi ma'am. You are here, and uh, anyways, however, before going to the deliberation of Professor Datta, I would like to request my esteemed colleague, Mrs. Dipanita Depurukayastha, to introduce our guest, please. Over to Dipanita.
No network, I think.
I think no network. Okay, she is within a few while. Within a while, she is going to join us. Anyways, for the participant, we are very happy to have participants across the nation, even from outside the country also, and. I am really thankful to the participants for registering with us and following us in this most important and vibrant event. Please be with us, give your comments, and motivate us with your comments. And we are visible in the live YouTube channel of GC College IQAC, and the channel is YouTube. The name of the channel is GCC E Academia. So I think this Dipanita is with us.
Her device is not connected. She is trying
Welcome, Mr.
Good
Chakraborty.
Good
In the
afternoon.
session, second session.
Good afternoon.
Dipanita, are you getting us?
No.
Dipanita, are you getting us? Is the network problem going on everywhere?
later.
I think again some network issues. I would like to request Devashish, please read out the biodata of Professor Datta.
Yeah. Okay, madam. Probably the Pandita madam is facing some network issues. Yeah. So, Dr. Binayak Datta is an assistant professor in the Faculty of History in Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. He read history at Nehu, earned a PhD with his dissertation on ulama in politics, a study of the role of ulama in Eastern Bengal and Assam. The research attempted to understand the emergence of diverse traditional and modern social codes in northeastern India, their reinventions of self and interventions in the politics of colonial modernity, the dynamics of migration, grassroots mobilization, by these forces and construction of communal identity and citizenship of what we today understand as the northeast of India. So before joining NEHU, Dr. Datta used to teach in the Department of History, Assam University, in its Difu campus and St. Edmunds College in Shillong. He was also a visiting visiting fellow at the ICSSR's OKD Institute of Social Change and Development in Guwahati. It was during that period he completed his study on the history of the judiciary in Northeast India, and this led to the publication of his book, History of the Judiciary in Assam: Law Courts and Lawyers, DVS Publishers, 2013. Binayak Datta, before joining academia, was a qualified advocate practicing law in the Guwahati High Court, and his twin backgrounds in social sciences and law have helped him to perceive issues and problems differently and experiment with interdisciplinary approaches to teaching and research. He has published 3 books, 1 monograph, and about 50 articles on partition, migration, and citizenship in Northeast India in various national and international journals. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Binayak Datta with us. So it's over to Sharupa Bhattacharjee Madam for continuation.
Thank you, Devashish. Actually, he is Mushkil Ashan he is the main Mushkil Ashan of any technical problem. Thank you very much, and so over to Binayak Datta sir. And we'll be in the backstage, sir.
Yeah, and that's all right, ma'am. I mean, you can be where you are, even if you are there with me. I have no issues.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
No problems.
Okay.
First, I must really place on record my gratitude to GC College, the IQSC, and the Department of Political Science for having given me an opportunity to speak on migration in Northeast India. It's a very broad kind of a study that you propose to do. I would, of course, not to do something as extensive as that. I would like to limit myself to Assam. But having said that, I'm also grateful to both my co-panelists, Mr. Chakraborty and Padma Shri Patricia Mukhim, for having set the context for my presentation today. And the reason why I talk about, their setting the context is while one gave us some kind of a genetic overview of this whole idea of migration and the processes of migration and the process of peopling in this region. I'm really grateful to Padma Shri Patricia Mukhim for having very clearly pointed out the difference between, this entire politics that happens around indigenous, autochthons, and migrants. And her opening remarks actually place us in a much comfortable ground when we start talking about it. As I said, my entire modus of presentation would be very conversational. And I want to basically start off by talking about a few basic issues. If you look into, as a student of history, one of the things that we were often told about when we started talking about Assam, when you're talking about Assam, we are not talking about Assam as we understand it today. We are talking about Assam that stretches from Karatoya to right up to, in that sense, it was not called Assam, it was called Kamarupa. And, the ruler who's associated with Kamarupa is Bhaskara Varman. And if you actually look into the kind of sources that you deal with, when you talk about Bhaskara Varman's reign in Kamarupa, you invariably talk about a particular land grant called Nidhanpur land grant. And if you look at the Nidhanpur land grant, there are two things which are evident from those land grants. There are many other land grants. There are Dubi land grant, there are Tezpur land grant, there are many other land grants which can be ascribed to various dynasties who have ruled over what we understand as Kamarupa. And those land grants invariably tell us two things, that these land grants were means through which people from outside the region were actually given space to settle down. And two, these land grants also tell us that essentially people were constantly migrating, and there was no anathema to migration into what we understand as Northeast India. So that is basically the broad framework with which I like to situate my study. Because, today when we contextualize this whole question of migration, we probably see a certain paradox. On the one hand, you have globalization, where everybody wants to integrate with everybody else across the globe. And on the other hand, you have actually doors getting closed and people saying, no, you cannot migrate, and we don't welcome people to come in and settle down in areas which we presume or we kind of presuppose as exclusive to us. So these kind of contradictory forces, the forces of globalization on the one hand, ultranationalism on the other, essentially has a direct bearing on the process of migration and the politics that emerges out of it. And so in that context, I want to probably also make a reference to the fact that if you look into the history of Assam, let's start off with the geography. And there are there is one particular text which I want to speak about, and that is John McCosh's Topography of Assam. Most of us have essentially, those who are in academia, those who work on migration and citizenship in Northeast India, have engaged with John McCosh. And McCosh's book is interesting because it invariably gives us an idea about the kind of land routes, what are the routes that actually connect Assam, as we understand it, to its southern borders or its southern neighbors. Because when you start talking about migration, it's interesting to see, first the geography, and a geography and a communication network, which invariably tells us that if there are communication channels, these communication channels probably are pointers towards the fact that people must have been migrating by the use of these communication channels. If I were to basically focus on the migration routes between Assam and Bengal, because most of the times when we are actually seeing the contest over migration, it's very interesting to see that the contest happens with migration across the south. It does not happen across migration in anywhere else. So the predominant contest that happens in Northeast India is the migration that has happened from south towards the north, and that is essentially from Bengal into what is called Northeast India. So if you look into the roots that is there between traditional idea of Assam, please remember that when we are trying to talk in terms of traditional idea of Assam, we are not talking about Assam as it is now. We are talking about almost the whole of Northeast India, leaving out probably Manipur, Northwest, the Nepha. These are areas that we leave out. But we are invariably talking about Assam in the context of a more broad framework. So we identify four routes of communication between Assam and Bengal. One which is a river route, and the other three which are land routes. And this is very clearly identified in John McCosh's Topography of Assam. If I were to start off my conversation by talking about the routes, the first river route was actually something that connected Gwalpara with Calcutta. Gwalpara down the Brahmaputra, through Jamalpur, along the Pabna, through the Ganges, finally reaching Calcutta. And it's interesting to actually point out that the routes were such, this river route was such, that the route between Gwalpara and Calcutta, if somebody was traveling between Gwalpara and Calcutta, it would take the person 25 to 35 days. And if somebody were to travel from Calcutta to Gwalpara, it would take around 33 to 43 days. So this is the river route. Now, apart from that, we have overland routes. The first overland route was from Bengal to Assam, which was through Murshidabad, Malda, Dinajpur, Rangpur to Gwalpara. Incidentally, in more modern sense, it was also the route through which mails or dak used to travel from Calcutta to Assam. The third route that we want to talk about, and which is the second land route, was Dhaka, through Dhaka, then through Jamalpur, through Singimari, and through Gwalpara, into Assam. And the fourth, and I'm located right now in Shillong. It's a very interesting. The fourth route was a route that passed through Sylhet, Cherrapunji, Mawphlang, Nongklao, Ranikudam, Khanapara, and then to Guwahati. So essentially, what I'm basically trying to point out is that there were established communication networks between Assam, Assam and the other parts of India through Bengal. And so therefore, there were migration routes which definitely point towards migration, an established pattern and process of migration, at least in the modern times. Unlike Mr. Chakraborty, who spoke about prehistory and early history, I would like to focus on the processes of migration in what I understand as early colonial, and post-colonial, Northeast India. My major focus of study would obviously be Assam. But having spoken about the Varmanas of Kamaru and the Sarastambas and the Palas, who invariably stretched their rule from 6th century to the 12th century in Assam. If you look at the land grants, I want to start off there, because if you look at the land grants are significant because it talks about the settlements that were made to the Brahmins. It was essentially settlement that was made to encourage the clearing of wastelands and the settlement of people, conversion of non-revenue yielding lands to revenue yielding land, and basically encouraging a significant process of in-migration into Assam from various other parts of the country. Now, here, I want to also point out that the process of migration, when we talk about migration in the historical sense, it is not something that is unique that we are trying to point out. If you look into, most of the standard texts on environmental history, we'll find out that there has been, right from the time of the 13th or 14th century onwards, there has been a significant 14th century onwards. There has been a significant process of expansion and encouragement towards what we understand as the expansion of economic development, trade, and population migration. And this is something that is fairly well established, both in the context of the Americas, in the context of Europe, and of course in the context of India. And in that sense, Assam is no exception. In fact, if we were to point out, when I talk about Northeast, most of the information that we have on Northeast is essentially Assam-centric, because in the first case, we have an overwhelming preponderance of positivist materials. In other words, documents or some kind of a written record or some kind of a documentary evidence. It could be inscriptional also, which invariably points towards this process of expansion of population, settlement of population, and migration of population. So in that sense, I want to invariably turn your attention to the fact that the idea of development of the economy and the idea of progress was intimately connected with the idea of exploration of frontiers, with the process of expansion and settlement of cultivation over fallow land, and the conversion of non-revenue generating areas into revenue generating plots. And this is basically the foundation of migration, settlement, and expansion of population over a period of time till the coming in of colonial rule in India. and here Assam is not an exception. I want to, in this process, also make a reference to what actually transforms during the Ahom period. Now, if you look into the trend of politics, the trend of attitudes, one of the things that one can see during the Ahom period is in the early years of the Ahom period. And here it's very, very important because it also helps us to understand why in today's world, in colonial and in post-colonial Assam, why we are actually so very, very allergic towards migration. And here, when you start looking at the Ahom rule, one necessarily comes to realize that this communication networks that have been flourishing in Assam in the pre-Ahom period, be it through the rule of the Varmanas, the Salastambas, or the Palas, was something that was actually destroyed by the Ahoms. And it was destroyed by the Ahoms because the Ahoms generally did not appreciate any kind of an interaction or any kind of a migration from the West. Now, when I'm talking about the West, I'm basically talking about mainland India. And they used to generally keep their communications with what we understand in today's world as Upper Burma. So in that sense, the Ahoms essentially discouraged this kind of a communication or migration from the West into Assam till you see the process of Hinduization of the Ahom rulers. And that is about 16th, 17th centuries, when you actually also see qualified encouragement to migration. Now, when I'm talking about qualified encouragement to migration, I'm invariably talking about encouragement that came to migration, especially for people who actually, in the perception of the Ahoms, quote unquote, could contribute to their development. And so, therefore, here I'm. This is basically the preliminary observations that I'm making, because one has to understand the contexts of migration, the politics and the policy of migration that one sees in Assam before the coming in of the colonial rule. Now, when you start looking at the coming in of colonial rule, I am obviously turning to 1826. As we all know, that with the coming in of the British into what we understand today as Northeast India, and then you have the Anglo-Burmese War, the first Anglo-Burmese War, which ultimately culminated in the Treaty of Yandabu. So the colonial state was first able to establish its rule in Assam, first in Lower Assam, and then post 1830s in Upper Assam, where you see a new kind of society, a new kind of economy developing in Assam as a result of colonial rule. Now, one of the foundational aspects that you have to remember that when you start talking about colonial rule is that there is an economic foundation that is there to colonial rule, but there is also a social superstructure. If I were to actually add to that if there was economic transformation, there was also social superstructure associated with the migration and settlement of people. And this is something that we need to reconcile with when we are starting to talk about migration and settlement of people in Assam. Now, one of the first things that you essentially realize when you start talking about Assam is the establishment of tea gardens. Tea plantations actually. And if you look at the tea plantations, you will find that, the people who established themselves in tea gardens were actually migrants, apart from the planters who got huge land holdings to establish these tea plantations. But the real people who worked these tea plantations, who got these tea plantations going, made it into a profitable enterprise, were people who were migrants. And so therefore, there was a large scale encouragement that was given to migration of population from various parts of what we understand in Northeast India as mainland India. So therefore, I mean, without getting into this debate on the stereotype between what is mainland and what is periphery, when I talk about Northeast, the part of India that is towards the east is essentially what constitutes the other parts of Northeast India. When you talk about the West, you are talking about what is understood as mainland India. So what is called Jharkhand today, what is called the Chota Nagpur Plateau, what is called Central India. So therefore, you have large-scale migration of people from Bihar. At that particular point of time, we did not have Jharkhand and Bihar. Bihar was, we understand Bihar as some kind of a composite unified territory. We have people migrating from Odisha. We have people migrating from central provinces. You have people migrating from United Provinces, which is UP, primarily. And we also have migrants from Madras. Now, when I'm talking about Madras, I'm not talking about Madras as we understand it now. I'm talking about Madras Presidency of colonial India. So when I'm talking about Madras Presidency, I can probably also include, what is today understood as Andhra Pradesh, what is understood as Tamil Nadu. So, people from various parts of the country came in and became part of this process of economic transformation of what is essentially understood as Upper Assam, because tea gardens were essentially established in Upper Assam, except for two other places. One, of course, there was some amount of tea gardens that were established in Kachar, and there was some amount of tea gardens that were established in Sylhet. So in these tea gardens, what actually moved the tea gardens, what actually got these tea gardens going was migration and settlement of people from these various provinces of colonial India. So therefore, you have people like people from Bihar, Orissa, etc. Now that's one part of the story. But what we are actually concerned more in this presentation is the migration of people who comes in not in the first phase. I want to specifically divide settlement and migration based on the economic, what was actually moving the economy. What was first moving the economy was, of course, trade, tea plantations. But what was moving the second phase of the colonial economy was the establishment or expansion of agriculture. And here, when I'm talking about agriculture, I'm talking about expansion of rice cultivation and various kinds of rice cultivation. And in this sense, I want to essentially point out that it is very, very important for us to understand that this kind of concern with rice cultivation is also related to the cultivation of tea, because as people migrated, settled down in the tea plantations, as population increased, there were more mouths to feed. And so there was also this continuous colonial concern that was there with the process of cultivation of things other than tea. So while on the one hand you have tea plantations, on the other there was also a realization that we also need food grains, to feed the people who had come in to service the plantations. So this was one of the reasons why people began to really think in terms of expansion of further migration of people from the south, from Bengal. There was a lot of debate, but the other factor, which we probably do not mention, is the famine of Orissa in 1866. Now, this great famine of Orissa in 1866 really scared the colonial state, because for the first time, the colonial state wanted provinces to become self-sufficient in terms of food grains. One of the things that we'd have to understand, traditionally, there are certain stereotypes. One of the things that if you go and talk in Assam, they'll say that this is a land of lahe lahe, and lahe lahe means slow. But that is a stereotype, and it's a very wrong stereotype, because see, what happens is that the people who were settled there had limited cultivation, and they were very happy with whatever they cultivated. They had basically some kind of a semi-subsistence. I'm very conscious when I say this. They were not subsistence farmers. They were semi-subsistence. So they cultivated a little more than what they could actually need in their everyday existence, but not enough to actually generate huge surplus. But for the colonial state, when they came into Assam and they set up an elaborate administrative network between 1826 and say 1866, the administration in Assam, which was then part of Bengal, one of the things that we need to probably also accommodate as students of history is that these parts of Assam, which were gradually taken over by the colonial state, were made part of Bengal presidency. And so Assam was gradually made dependent on the food grains cultivation in Bengal. Now, post 1866, for the first time, you have a very serious concern among the colonial officers that we need to make Assam self-sufficient in terms of cultivation of rice, especially cultivation of food grains, because what happens if there is another famine like the Orissa famine in Bengal? What is going to happen to the administration in Assam? What is going to happen to Northeast India? And obviously, when you start talking in terms of food grain production, the production does not happen without hands which are actually engaged in food grains production. And it is this desire to expand food grains production that ultimately led to a very serious engagement with the process of, again, encouragement to migration from across, from Bengal to Assam. And so, therefore, this whole debate started. If I were to actually just point out, this whole debate started as to who should be the ideal set of people to come in and cultivate food grains in Assam. And this debate is visible in colonial records. It's fairly well documented. It's fairly well articulated that between 1850s and 60s on the one hand and 1890s, there was a very serious concern on the part of the colonial state to encourage, the migration of people and the expansion of agriculture in Assam. Because one of the things that we have to remember that it was just not enough to generate revenue through tea. They also felt that large tracts of land were lying fallow. They were lying what they considered as unproductive. And if one were to go back to the larger political economic philosophy of the colonial state, every inch of land must be used to generate revenue. So there were large tracts of land that were lying fallow. There was also this anxiety which was related to the process of cultivation. There was an anxiety that was related to food production. And so therefore it was decided that there should be some kind of an encouragement that should be made towards immigration of peasants, specifically peasants from East Bengal. Now the point that we have to remember is that while earlier the encouragement was for the migration of tea garden laborers, we have various systems. One of the system was the Sardari system, which was encouraged to ensure the migration of tea laborers. Here we see that post 1870, there was a very conscious attempt on the part of the colonial state to encourage the migration of East Bengali peasants from districts of East Bengal into Assam. Now, even on that question, even on that issue, there was a debate. And what was the debate? which were the people that needed to be encouraged. And there was some discussion that, well, it's very important for us to realize that post 1874, Assam was already constituted into a separate province. It was a chief commissioner's province post 1874, and it was separated from Bengal. I'm not getting into the politics of the constitution of the chief commissionership, but it's important to mention that because the chief commissioner of Assam actually put in a lot of opinions on this question of colonization of wastelands. And this colonization of wastelands, there are two words that is very, very important here. One is the word colonization, and true, that the second word that is very, very important is wasteland. So any land that did not give adequate amount of revenue, which was lying fallow, was considered to be a wasteland and was therefore considered to be fit enough for settlement of population. Now, one of the things that is important is that by 1898, we actually see that the Chief Commissioner of Assam, Henry Cotton, very clearly pointing out that there were 5 million acres of land that were lying vacant in the 5 districts of Assam, and which was awaiting the axe and the plow. This is the word that he used. They were awaiting the axe and the plow. So there was an encouragement that was given to this process of migration from Bengal. Now, the other point that I want to highlight here is that contrary to what we actually believe, we have been hearing all these epithets, these prefixes that are generally attached to these migrants, the latest being termites. So we started off with vultures, then we went to ants, then we spoke about termites. Now, contrary to all these notions that these land-hungry peasants would swoop down on Assam, considering the fact that there would be ample amount of free land, the colonial state realized that people were really not interested to come to Assam because of weather conditions and health reasons. And so therefore, the colonial state had to give a lot of encouragement, a lot of incentive to these East Bengali peasants to migrate from East Bengal. And here, when I'm talking about migration from East Bengal, I'm invariably conscious about the fact that, we are talking about migration of people from those districts of Bengal which had a tremendously high land-man ratio. So we are talking about Tipera, we are trying to talk in terms of Noakhali, we are trying to talk in terms of Mymensingh. And when we are trying to look at this kind of migration, we actually see that an overwhelming number of people who migrate to Assam from Bengal between 1881 and 1891 are from Mymensingh. And that is why one of the things that invariably comes across to us is that this migration is given the nomenclature migration. And so therefore, it's not that Mymensingh was the only place from where people migrated. People were migrating from various other districts as well. So therefore, you have migration from Noakhali, you have migration from Tipera. As you know, that post 1790s, the colonial state had already constituted a district called Plains Tipera, Tipperah, which is distinct from Hills Tripura. The hill areas were actually, retained under the direct rule of the Tripura Maharaja, and the plains areas was actually taken away from the Maharaja, but retained under his zamindari. Now, this is very, very important because in post 1947, when I'm talking about migration, I will also make some kind of a reference to migration in Tripura. There are a lot of conceptions and misconceptions and debates centering around the migration in Tripura. So I will come to that post 1947. In the context of migration in Northeast, that's also very, very important. But let's for the moment focus on what is understood as Assam. And in the context of Assam, it is very, very important for us to understand that people were encouraged to migrate. They were cajoled to migrate. They were forced to migrate. And so therefore, the colonial officers who were stationed in Tipera, who were stationed in Mymensingh, who were stationed in Noakhali, were instructed by the chief commissioner in Assam to ensure that a steady stream of migrants, essentially peasants, who incidentally were Muslims, were encouraged to come, migrate, and settle down in Assam to transform these fallow lands to agricultural fields. Now, this is something that we need to understand when we are starting to talk about migration. So, therefore, if we are trying to talk in terms of migration in Northeast India, we have to identify, migration in phases. So, let's come to 20th century. I have spoken about 19th century migration, the reticence of the Bengali peasants, and they being cajoled, coaxed, forced to migrate and settle down in what we understand as Assam. One of the things that actually happens, post 1901 is something which is spectacular. By 1905, you have the establishment of railway networks, which link Assam and East Bengal. And here I must say that these the improvement of communication networks, earlier, as I started off my presentation by talking about river routes, I started talking about 3 land routes. But I now want to talk about expansion of communication network, and the establishment of railways definitely gave a boost to the migration of people. So therefore, you have a large-scale migration of people from the districts of East Bengal into Assam, and this migration happened from Dhaka, Pabna, Rangpur, and Mymensingh. So if earlier we were talking about Noakhali, we were talking about Tipera, now we see that there is a large-scale expansion of migration of people from the eastern districts of Bengal into Assam. I want to also in the process point out that this is not the only source of migration. So peasant migration is not the only source of migration in Assam. Post 1826, you also see that a lot of what we call, middle class migration also happens, because you have a lot of traders, you have a lot of Bengali amlas, as they call it. In fact, if you go into different parts of Assam, across the 5 districts, whether you go to Sibsagar, you go to Lakhimpur, you go to Darang, you go to Kamrup, every place, or even across upper and lower Assam, you will find that every place there is something called that Amala Potti. Amala means basically people who are part of the colonial officialdom. So a lot of these Bengali a lot of migrants also came who were part of the colonial officialdom. But in terms of numbers, the people who came in as peasants far outnumbered the people who came in as colonial officers or colonial servicemen. So here I want to point out that by the first decade of the 20th century, there was a dramatic transformation of the process of migration and settlement of population in Assam. But this process was not only aggravated by the establishment of the railway, but there is a political development that gave a boost to this migration. And that political process was the reconstitution of the province of Assam to constitute what is called the Eastern Bengal and Assam province. That happened in 1905. And one of the obvious, I'm located at Shillong. I stay in Shillong from here. One of the things that I kind of have to point out is that the capital of Assam for a short while was actually shifted from Shillong to Dhaka. And that happened between 1905 and 1911. But when you're trying to talk in terms of migration, that was also a time, and it's very interesting to see, that is also a time when a lot of Bengali Amulas actually sold their houses in Shillong and migrated to Dhaka. And so there's a very interesting narrative about how there's this process of administrative convenience, communication networks contribute towards understanding the process of migration, in migration and out migration. And all these Amulas, again come back to Shillong post 1911 when partition of Bengal is annulled and when the capital comes back to Shillong. So, one of the things that we have to remember is that migration of people have been a part of our reality for a very, very long time. And if I were to say this, that while it's almost stating a platitude when I say that migration is basically the story of human civilization, but if you look at Northeast India, one of the things that you'll have to understand is that right from 6th century, I'm talking about Bhaskara Varman of Kamarupa, from 6th century AD right till the Ahom period, you have one story of migration. It's a continuous land flow. People are migrating from various parts of South Asia, and they're coming to Assam. People from Assam are also migrating to Bengal. There is a communication network. This gets disrupted for a short while the Ahoms are a little apprehensive, but again gets revived as the Ahom rulers convert to Hinduism. And one can, if one were to actually refer to writings by colonial officers, Assamese colonial officers in the early part of the 20th century, one can also trace correspondence between a very intimate, very, very nice correspondence between the people who are administrative heads in Kamrup and the people who are administrative heads in East Bengal, especially the Fauzdar, Mughal Fauzdar at Sylhet. So in that sense, there was this communication, there was this network. Colonial state also gave a boost to this process of migration, first through the inflow of colonial officialdom, people who are part of the colonial administration, and then by the encouragement that was given to the agriculturists from Eastern Bengal. But one of the things that one sees, if one were to go back to the census of 1911, for the first time, you actually see the beginning of this anxiety over migration. And, this is very, very important because this is also a period when between 1911 and 1916, there was this lot of discussion between the colonial officialdom. And for the first time, they begin to reverse their policy. If earlier they were encouraging migration, now they were actually trying to disengage themselves with the process of migration, and they were trying to discourage it. And one of the obvious offshoots of that policy of discouragement was the line system. For those of us who are familiar with stories of migration and anti-immigration movements, we are also familiar with this story of the line system, a process that actually was begun by the colonial officials in Nagaon, and later on expanded to other parts of Assam. And in 1937, you see this entire politics heating up. Now, there are two things that, one needs to probably highlight here when we are trying to talk in terms of migration and politics over migration. One, that post 1919, one actually sees the gradual engagement of electoral politics in Assam. And with the coming in of electoral politics, you also see the politics of what is called the politics of sons of the soil. So how does the people who are from Assam articulate themselves and articulate their concerns about migration, about settlement. And so therefore, on the one hand, you see the colonial officers basically talking about it. On the other hand, you also see a lot of debate that's happening in the Assam Legislative Council that is established on this question of migration and settlement. And people are very apprehensive. But that does not stop migration, because one of the things that happens along with migration is alienation of land. For those of us who are talking about migration, one of the things that we talk about is the human dimension of it, but we don't talk about the alienation of land dimension of it. And one of the ways in which one can understand migration is, and attitudes to migration, is by understanding the processes and the politics of alienation of land. So one actually sees that in the 1920s, till 1920s, even in the beginning of 1930s, one sees that there is a very conscious attempt on the part of the Assamese elite to sell their land in the villages and sell it to the immigrants. And this is very clearly reflected in the colonial records as well. In fact, if one were to go back to the Banking Committee Inquiry Report of the 1920s, which is related to Assam, one actually sees in the evidence part of it very detailed discussion of land alienation and how the indigenous people are actually alienating their land and selling it to the immigrants. Now, the other part that is associated with it is that, by 1930s, the colonial officers are very, very worried. Probably because they are also, under a lot of pressure of local politics. And so in 1931, the census superintendent of Assam, C.S. Mulan, is the census superintendent. And it is to Mulan that we actually trace a lot of anxiety that we see over migration and immigration. In fact, in his report of 1931, he actually creates quite a sensation when he actually compares the migrants to invaders. It's very, very interesting to actually see that the entire language that is associated with migration is undergoing a change. If earlier the people were encouraged, if the colonial state was encouraging the migrants, if the if the local indigenous landholders were actually selling their land to the migrants, by 1930s, you actually see the beginning of what is called immigration discourse. Immigration is essentially illegal migration. So this whole idea of immigration discourse essentially taking very, very deep roots in Northeast India post 1931. And so it is to Mulan that we actually ascribe these kind of terms like invaders, like ants, he continuously raises the anxiety to such a pitch. As I said, vultures. If 1921 census report spoke about immigrants as vultures, Mulan essentially called them invaders. Incidentally, it's very, very interesting because in a particular judgment of the Guwahati High Court of 2008, these Muslim migrants or immigrants were also called invaders. And so therefore, one can actually see how the impact of what was first articulated in 1931 also resonates even today. So this entire anxiety and politics over migration and immigration and settlement gets articulated thanks to the kind of politics that we see over actually something that starts off with electoral politics, a limited electoral politics post 1919, and a great electoral latitude that comes in after the Act of 1935. Because after the Act of 1935, you have the establishment of the Assam Legislative Assembly. And in this Legislative Assembly, you see this tremendous debate that is going on the part of the members of the assembly on this question of migration. So much so that the chief minister, who was called a premier of Assam, Sir Mohammad Sadullah, is forced to establish a committee, which is called the Line System Committee. And this committee was headed by a European member. The European member is known as Mr. Hockenhall. And so this is the Hockenhall Committee. The Hockenhall Committee report, which essentially goes into the question of line system. The Sadullah ministry collapses thanks to Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's initiative. I don't want to get into all that right now. That is not relevant so much for the question of migration and settlement. But the Congress ministry also decides to tender its resignation in 1939 with the outbreak of the Second World War, when the Congress decides not to have anything to do with the Second World War. And the League ministry again comes back. Sadullah again comes back as the premier or the chief minister, and he institutes what is called the Grow More Food campaign. And one of the things, if one were to actually go back to the diary of the then governor of Assam, one of the things that comes out, and this is also reflected in what the viceroy actually is writing about. The governor actually points out, saying that this Grow More Food is actually the Grow More Muslim campaign. So it's not so much the Grow More Food; it is basically Grow More Muslims, because it's basically encouraging immigrants from coming over from East Bengal into Assam on the pretext of expansion of agriculture. And so this continues. There is this tremendous anxiety. There is this tremendous debate. There is a tremendous amount of conflict, legislative and otherwise. For the first time, you also see a lot of popular conflict that is being generated, because once you have the legislative assembly, these members go back to their constituencies. They increase the anxiety of the people who are living in the constituencies. If you look at the deposition in most of these official records, the official committees, you will find that there is a lot of anxiety that is being expressed over the question of migration and settlement. People are talking about different culture, different way of life, bad habits. Immigrants are always identified with bad habits, and they are basically quintessential thieves. They are wife snatchers. These are some of the things that are invariably cattle snatchers. So these are some of the things. These are some of the stereotypes with which migration and immigration is often associated with. Between 1942 and 1947, there is a tremendous boost that is given to politics over migration and immigration, courtesy the active role of the Muslim League. And you also find that post 1942, the Muslim League is pretty clear that it wants Assam to be part of their Pakistan scheme. And one of the ways in which they very, very clearly articulate, and this is something that we have not yet tried to do adequate amount of research, is that this whole idea of land settlement and migration essentially becomes the core of the Muslim League plan to conquer Assam for Pakistan. And this is something that we need to probably articulate. Not that we are trying to give vent to a certain kind of anxiety that continues even today, but I think it's important to highlight that, because there is a lot of popular ground level politics that is associated with migration and settlement. For example, in 1947, sometime in the month of March, Maulana Abdul Hamid Khan Bhashani, he comes to Sylhet. And he actually comes there, organizes a meeting. There are about 5,000 to 10,000 people in a meeting. The meeting is in Maulavi Bazar. And he actually tells the people in very, very crass language, in very, very crass, very, very rustic language. I'm sorry, probably the language, it should be a rustic language. He says, cholo cholo dorong cholo potit joming dakhol koro. So, let's go, just come along with me. Let's go to Darang. Darang is a part of the Brahmaputra Valley. And he says, Potid Jomin Dakhal Karo, which means essentially, let's conquer, let's capture the fallow land. So this kind of politics resonates till 1947. And, this kind of anxiety over migration continues to be there till 1947. I have taken a lot of time. I just want to devote the remaining portion on the politics post 1947, which actually starts affecting us more immediately. Now, there are two things that are here. One, post 1947, migration again becomes a very contested question. It becomes a contested question because when you are starting to talk about migration, you are invariably associating yourself with this entire debate between who is an immigrant and who's a refugee. And this is a debate that continues to resonate even now, courtesy the debates that we have on the Citizenship Amendment Act. Who's an immigrant and who's a refugee? So for the first time, post 1947, you have, as ma'am had pointed out in the morning, that there is an attempt, a very successful attempt at kind of drawing an arbitrary line across maps, and where communities are actually separated, nationalities are created, citizenship is created without even any regard to ethnic or cultural or linguistic ties. So therefore, for example, I can definitely say this, that the Khasi, Jaintia, and the Garo, for example, the three communities, predominantly the predominant communities in Meghalaya, are actually partitioned right across, because the Garo Hills is separated from Maimansingh, and the Khasi Jaintia areas are separated from the Khasi Jaintia areas of Sylhet. One of the stereotypes that we actually have is that Sylhet is basically a land of either the Hindus or the Muslims. That's not true, because there is a lot of indigenous communities in Sylhet. The Khasi Jaintias are one of the most important indigenous communities who are actually still living in Sylhet. So in that sense, partition happens, and there is this whole politics that happens over migration. Again, people are continuously moving, as a BBC documentary on partition points out, that about 15 million people lost their homes, in Punjab. I'm sure these documentaries have not taken into consideration the loss in the East, because partition does not just happen in the West, it also happens in the East. So migration becomes a very, very important issue when it comes to the Eastern question in post-colonial India. And a lot of migration happens, one, because of economic opportunity seekers, and two, because of religious persecution that actually systematically takes place in East Pakistan. And and not just Hindus. I want to point this out, that religious persecution is a very, very interesting category, because not just were the Hindus persecuted in the early between 1947 and 1950, you also see a lot of Muslims being persecuted in East Pakistan, and they were the people who are actually opposing the Muslim League. They were the Jamiyati Muslimans, as they called themselves, the Muslims who are part of the Jamiyat Ulema Hind. So they were the people who also migrated to parts to Assam as a result of partition. The third category of people, and here I started talking about the indigenous communities. As a result of the closing of borders across the Khasi Jaintia hills, there was a large-scale migration of Khasi Jaintia people from the border areas into, for example, into mainland, Khasi Jaintia territories. For example, when I talk about the Ribhoy area, one of the areas where a large-scale resettlement of Khasi Jaintia migrants from southern, southern Khasi Hills actually take place is the Ribhoi area. Right across from, if one is traveling from Shillong to Guwahati, right across the slope down Umiam, from Umiam to Jorabat, you have this settlement of people from, from these areas. So therefore, there is this huge question of migration that happens as a result of partition. And this migration happens, people are displaced, and politics happens over migration. I want to point out, flag 2-3 things. One, that right from the Constituent Assembly debates, right up to the first Provisional Parliament of 1950, there was a debate on migration. How should these migrants be treated? And the Parliament was very, very clear that there must be a distinction between immigrants and refugees. Those who came as a result of persecution were refugees, and those who came in because they wanted to have better economic opportunities were immigrants. And this is very clearly pointed out in the Constituent Assembly debates. I've recently done up a monograph on it. But the other part of it that I want to highlight is that, till 1971, we need to understand that the politics in what is called East Pakistan was extremely contested. So if 1950 was, till 1950, you see the first wave of displacement and migration from East Pakistan to Assam, the second big wave of migration actually takes place between 1965 and 1971. You have a lot of camps that are established across the Jaintia Hills. You have camps which are established across Khasi Hills. You have camps which are established in Garo Hills. For example, the Balat camp that gets established as a result of the politics that leads to the Indo-Bangla War. Large-scale displacement of people happen at that particular point of time. A lot of debate also takes place on this question of migration and settlement in the Meghalaya Legislative Assembly. So this is something that we need to probably take on board, because when you are articulating the kind of stories on migration, most of these stories of migration do not accommodate these kind of concerns. But in Assam, there are two things that I want to highlight. One, there was a huge movement on the question of migration and settlement, and that is the movement which was led by the All Assam Students Union. And this movement invariably gets a lot of resonance over a period of time. So 1985 is not the only time when all these things get settled. So you have this being resurrected in 2005, because in 2005 you actually see for the first time a very, very official documentation of the need to do the NRC. One of the things that we have to understand is that the NRC process is also is not part of the Assam Accord, and this is very, very important. The NRC is not part of the Assam Accord, but it is definitely a very, very interesting part of the post-Assam Accord deliberation on this question of migration. We probably also need to highlight that over the period of years, there has really not been too much of understanding of the fact that there is a very clear legal distinction between immigrants and refugees. The reason why I'm highlighting this difference is, even if we don't get into the debate on the Citizenship Amendment Act, in 1950, the Parliament passed an act called the Illegal Immigrants Expulsion from Assam Act 1950. And this particular act legalized or legitimized the distinction between immigrants and refugees. And so this entire debate on immigrants versus refugees is actually very, very clearly articulated in the legal infrastructure that we have in post-colonial India. This is something that we need to take on board when we are trying to talk about the question of migration and settlement. The other thing that we need to take on board is that the role played by the judiciary on this question of migration and settlement. I want to highlight one or two small judgments. I start off by talking about the Sarbananda Sonowal judgment of 2005. It was a judgment which actually is a seminal judgment, which has tremendous ramifications in Northeast India. And this judgment in para 40, para 56 of the judgment, I'm actually laying it out because there seemed to be a lot of confusion over how does one necessarily understand the question of post-1947 migration and settlement. And this judgment actually settles this debate between immigrants versus refugees. And it says that if you're a refugee, you are not an immigrant. And this is very, very important. If you are a refugee, you are not an immigrant. And you are covered by the Act of 1950. The other judgment, and this is where probably, unfortunately, we have, I have to make, I have a lot of respect. I've been part of the judiciary myself, because as lawyers, we're also officers of the court. I want to point out that probably the judiciary has not been very, very, detailed in its reading of its own judgments. And so therefore, in 2008, you have another judgment which says that the law does not make a difference between refugees and immigrants. That is not true. If one goes by the law and also by judicial interpretation, the law of 1950 and the judicial interpretation of 2005, one actually sees that the position of migration and immigration, migration by refugees and immigration is fairly well settled, and that refugees who have come into Northeast India because of religious or political persecution or fear of persecution. Now, please remember, it is not just actual experience; it's also fear of persecution. Are actually not immigrants. So, in that sense, we need to also understand this difference between immigrants and non-immigrants. So just because you are a migrant, it necessarily does not mean you are an illegal immigrant. And this understanding actually has wide-reaching ramification because it also has its impact on understanding who is a D-voter, who is supposed to be in the detention camp, who's supposed to be a migrant and an illegal migrant, and who essentially becomes part of post-colonial state in India. Without getting into too much of a controversy, I want to just close. As it is, the moment you start talking about contemporary politics, you are getting into controversy. But some amount of controversy is unavoidable when you're trying to talk in terms of this historicizing migration and immigration in Northeast India. One of the things that we need to probably also point out that there is this recent debate that has been generated on implementation of Clause 6 of the Assam Accord. Who are supposed to be the indigenous, or who are supposed to be the who could be construed as natives of Assam. And one of the things that I want to point out is that there are a number of circulars which very clearly point out that if you originally hail from the district of Sylhet, and if you have a house in Assam, in post-colonial Assam, as in post-colonial means after 1947, you are a native of Assam. And this is something which is also very well settled in the circulars. There are a lot of myths, there are a lot of confusions. I think the law is pretty well settled. The confusion is in the politics. I think politics thrives because of confusion. I don't want to get too much into all of this right now. I just want to close my presentation by saying that I must thank GC College, the IQAC of GC College, for giving me the opportunity to articulate myself. on this essentially important, extremely relevant and contemporary theme of engagement, public engagement. And I must really, without sounding very, I don't want to flatter Ma'am Patricia, on a panel which I'm sharing with her, because I also will, she can actually call me up and chastise me. But I really want to thank you, ma'am, for having placed this fundamental understanding of, this whole debate on immigration at the very beginning in your observations in the morning. And thank you so much. It's a huge privilege to be part of a panel where you and Mr. Chakravarti are there. And thank you, GC College, once again for giving me the opportunity. Thank you once again.
Thank you from my side, because I am really enriched with the discussion you have made. And a lot of similarities I should also pointed out. One of the things that today's the plain land Brahmaputra, the population, when it is arose, it is a mixture of population from East Asian ancestry and the South Asian, predominantly South Asian ancestry. Now, these population is raised within the perhaps within the 1500 to 2000 years, not much older than that. And also, when we analyze the East Bengal residents, now today's Bangladeshi, they also some are considerable amount of East Asian ancestry. That means that the population relation was already there. So, in my point of view, your point of view is one point. My point is also there, that how can you differentiate an indigenous or non-indigenous or whatever these things? These are not scientific at all. These things are from my side only. And what Dr. Datta, I just want to point it out that initially, during the historical phase, Bhaskar Barma and this contemporary phase, what is the primary factor that promoted the migration?
Okay. You want an answer right now, or do we take the questions? I don't know how the organizers want to do it. I mean, ideally, I could go. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, sir. So actually, thanks a lot for the beautiful presentation, and it is really a privilege for us and to have such a beautiful presentation to hear from you. And I'm here inviting Dr. Debashish Sharma to coordinate the questions that we are already having in the screen. Debashish, please.
Yeah. Thank you, madam. So I think Binayak sir can take up Raj Pradeep sir's question first, and then we'll go with the comments.
Yeah, I think Ma'am Patricia also wants to. Ma'am.
Yeah, madam, please unmute yourself.
You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. No, I want to thank Binayak for that really enlightening narrative. You know, I've never heard such a very, very intensive kind of discourse on migration. And it's a great learning experience, especially to hear of, these record keepers, the British record keepers. They're very meticulous, actually, and that they should speak about how the elite of Assam are selling off their land, alienating their land, and the kind of construction of the migrants, as vultures and all that. So it seems we are repeating history. We are learning from them to caricature the so-called outsider, illegal immigrant, refugee, whatever. I think it really needs, if you could share your paper, it will be such a great education for
Thank
all
you
of
so
us.
much, ma'am. I'm honored.
Yeah.
I just want to, before, lest I forget, Sir, I want to answer to what Sir Chakravarti has asked on the question on what was the motive for migration and settlement during the time of Bhaskara Varman. Now, one of the things that one sees during the time of Bhaskara Varman of Kamrup is the process of Brahminization and the expansion of the Brahminical frontiers. And gradually you actually see that when I'm talking about Brahmanical frontiers, I'm not just talking about the expansion of Brahmins. I'm actually also talking about an ideology, gradually expansion of mainstream Brahmanical ideology into peripheral areas. And Bhaskara Varman of Kamrup essentially was a classic example of how Brahmanical ideology comes into Northeast India. And if one were to actually look at the grants that were made during the time of Bhaskara Varman, I make a specific reference to Nidhanpur land grant. Nidhanpur land grant was actually first issued by Bhaskara Varman's grandfather, Bhuti Varman. And Bhaskara Varman just reissued the land grant, almost restating the obvious that these land grants were given to certain Brahmins, Brahmin families. And what is important is that, two things. One, that this Nidhanpur is not in Brahmaputra Valley. Nidhanpur land grant was actually made outside the Brahmaputra Valley. It's in the Surma Valley. So in that sense, when you talk about Assam, even during the time of Bhaskara Varman, it invariably incorporated the Surma Valley as well. So Assam, there is a, I was listening to a television, interaction, and where there was this, a very, very, I don't want to name people because I think it's unethical, but I definitely would like to say this, a very, very established academic, essentially talking about Assam as in Assam proper, as if Assam essentially means only Brahmaputra Valley. I mean, if you go back to the times of Bhaskara Varman of Kamarupa, Assam was definitely not just the Brahmaputra Valley. It was extending right from, the borders of Bihar right into East Bengal. So that was Assam. So therefore, the idea was, why do you think land grants were given? These land grants were given because it is only the Brahmins who could actually legitimize these non-Brahmin rulers in a peripheral land. And one of the easiest ways to, because it is the Brahmins who generate genealogy, one of the ways to legitimize is to create a genealogy. So all these rulers traced their ancestry to Narakasur and, Bhagadatta. Now, it's very interesting to see how Bhaskara Varman of Kamrup could have traced his ancestry to Bhagadatta and Narakasur. And if the moment you trace it to Narakasur, you are also tracing it to Lord Vishnu. So basically, this is an ideological project. So land grant settlement is not just a question of actual peopling, P-O-P-L-I-N-G. It's not about peopling. It's also about the ideological transformation of a space. It's not just about the matter, it's also about the mind. And it's a combination of mind and matter that actually is the story of migration, settlement, and legitimization of that migration through land grants.
No, but Binayak, you didn't say a word about the Ahom rule. I mean, how was migration like during that time? They themselves were immigrants.
Yes.
And then what about the so-called caste Assamese? Didn't they migrate from somewhere?
No, absolutely, ma'am.
Who call themselves indigenous today actually migrated from somewhere. So,
absolutely.
I mean, and what about the Bodos, who are supposed to be the indigenous people of Assam? So how many waves of migration are we looking at?
In fact, ma'am, one of the ways in which we can understand the history of migration is by actually engaging in interdisciplinary studies. And the reason is very, very simple. If you go back to the Karbi, I was in Diffu for a long time, about 6 years. And one of the stories that I got to hear, and it's also commemorated by a public statue, is the story of Rongpharbi Rongbi. If you go to Karbi Anglong, you will see the story of Rongpharbi Rongbi. And the lady who actually, the brave lady who actually led her people to a safe place. And that's why they come into what is called Karbi Anglong. The point is, it is also a story of migration.
Yeah.
So the point that I'm trying to here highlight is that all the communities, including the Bengalis, who are settled in Northeast India, who for example, including the upper caste Brahmins who are settled in Nilachal Hill. Now, Nilachal is the hill where Kamakhya Shrine is located. If you go into the history of the Parvatiya Gohais, Parvatiya Gohais are the people who are supposed to be the keepers of the Kamakhya Shrine. They are basically immigrants. And the immigrants who are given grants, land grants, during the Ahom rule. Having said that, the Ahoms, it's not because I'm not much of an expert on the Ahoms. My understanding of the Ahoms is essentially colored by my readings of secondary literature. And I want to make a reference to a very, very interesting, two very, very important points. One, I want to refer to a book called Anglo-Assamese Relations by S.K. Bhuiyan. And between page 55 and page 58, S.K. Bhuiyan essentially gives us very, very clear idea about how the Ahoms initially came in, wanted to have a steady communication with the people in Burma, but did not want to have any kind of a communication with the people who are from what we understand as mainland India. This process undergoes a change with the coming in of, or with the Hinduization of the Ahom rulers. So you have Rudra Singha of the Ahom ruler, Rudra Singha, who essentially, began to encourage the coming in. The first migrants were undoubtedly Brahmins, who were brought in to legitimize the Ahom rulers also. Rulers invariably liked the migration of the priestly class, because the priestly class were the legitimizers of any rule. Incidentally, they are also the class that created this hierarchy and kind of created a legitimization of the superiority of the ruling elite. Having said that, I want to also point out that here, when I talk about this question of migration, the Ahoms did encourage migration, but it was qualified migration. There were two things that were important for the Ahoms. One, whether the migrants would actually serve the purpose of the Ahom kingdom. And the second was that all these people who migrated to the Ahom kingdom had to cut off their ties with their original homeland. They had to sever their ties. So basically, there is a process of acculturization that was the precondition for settlement, for migration and settlement during the Ahom period, and which actually continued even in the post-colonial period, because there is a huge debate on who is an Assamese, and one of the debates invariably say that if you can speak in Assamese, if you say that Assamese is your mother tongue, then you are an Assamese. And by that logic, in 1961, if you look at the census report of Mr. Pakentine, he says that thousands of Maimansinghi Muslims claimed that they were Assamese by just saying Amgo Bhasha Oshomya. This is actually written in the census report. This is not something that I am manufacturing. The problem is that colonial and post-colonial record keeping was fantastic. It's just that we choose not to read the records.
Around 2018, 29th April, a news broke out from Telegraph. So there, the genetic test of Ahoms have been done. We have the royal, some 21 members of royal Ahom family. They have collected samples, and 4 skeletons from Shivsagar area. They have collected samples. It is the initial report, not the final report. And what they found the entire population is highly closely related with the Thai people. Okay. Now, it is also confirming with the linguistic theory that the Ahoms are actually generally called Thai Ahom. Now, Thai means Thai Kadai language. Now, you see the Thai Kadai language, they have just left the Thai Kadai language and they have adopted a entirely new language, Assamese, which belongs to Indo-European family language. So you see the identification, the adaptation of new language altogether might have changed some or their identity, or might have just what is called camouflaging their earlier identity. That is also done to some extent.
Mr. Chakravarti, I want to just point out here that identity is 1/10 history and 9/10 politics. So, if it is 1/10 history, what you are telling us is basically genetics and history. But what is actually identity is 9/10 politics. So hence, we can understand this. That is probably something that, is within the domain of Ma'am Shwarupa's, discipline. She is from political science, so probably, she can shed more light on identity politics. That's not my field at all. Yeah, that's not my field. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I'm inviting Devashish. A lot of good questions have been put forward by our participants. Let us take one after another. Please, Devashish.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
So talking about field, I am probably the most inefficient one here. I belong to mathematics, and so it's difficult for me. But I'll try to put up those questions from the participants. This is from Mr. Krishanu Bhattacharjee. I think you can see it on screen. Is today's Northeast India witnessing a conflict between political migration since thousands of years and colonial economic migrations, which has resulted into current indigenous politics?
I don't think this story can be reduced to such simplistic terms. This conflict between economic migration and political migration. Migration is a very complex story, and as students of history, we need to understand that each migration story has many layers of its own. I don't think it's of course there is a conflict between political migration and economic migration. The constitutional paradigm in India makes this very, very clear distinction. If you go into the Constituent Assembly debates, and if you go into even the laws that have been enacted post 1947, I made a reference to one of the acts. There are thousands of circulars which are there in Assam, which invariably make a distinction between those who have come to Assam as a result of persecution. Persecution is part of political migration. And those who have come as a result of economic opportunity seeking. And the law actually says that if you have come after a particular point, it gives a time frame. And if you have come to Assam after a particular time frame, a timeline, and if you are an economic opportunity seeker, then you are an illegal immigrant. So, I mean, the whole idea of migration and immigration also is determined politically. It's not a contest, it's not a very simple story between economics and politics. It is basically a complex story where both economics and politics play a role.
Yeah.
Actually, it is the history of life and livelihood which makes the people to migrate. Because of life and livelihood, people become.
That's one of the ways of looking at it.
Yeah,
that's one of the ways of looking at it.
And here, I think the history of politics and economics, history of politics and economics can be accumulated, I think.
True.
Okay, so we have another question from Professor Shubhra Chaudhary, who wanted an earlier webinar. Do you approve the idea of undoing past immigration by sending the immigrant back?
I have just two things to say on this. One, first, how back do you go? Do you go back to the time of Bhaskara Varman of Kamrup and say that those people who came to Northeast India during Bhaskara Varman's time need to go back? You also don't know where they have come from. And the second part of it is that sending the immigrants back, where do you send them back? Who is willing to take them? Who is admitting that they belong to, they don't belong to you and they belong to them? In fact, if you just talk about Bangladesh, Ma'am Patricia will bear me out, and I'm sure many of the panelists will bear me out, that Bangladesh does not agree that all the people who we claim to be Bangladeshis belong to Bangladesh. They said that okay, we admit that some people are our people. We have taken them back, but just because they speak Bangla, it does not necessarily mean they are Bangladeshi. Bangladesh is a state. The problem is that we are invariably caught in this quagmire between who is a Bengali and who is a Bangladeshi.
Actually, this is something like a stigma.
Yeah.
No, of course it's a stigma, because that's how the politics of the state works. So just because you're a Bengali, you can be a Bengali and settled in England. You need not be a Bangladeshi at all.
Need not be Bangladeshi at all. Bangladesh is a separate country.
Yes. So what I'm trying to say is that where do you send them back?
The very term Bangladeshi is very pejorative. When you talk of Bangladeshi in normal parlance in the Northeast, it is it's equivalent to sort of the class that is beneath dignity, beneath labor class. This, that. It has so many connotations, and I think that the Prime Minister of Bangladesh would do well to discount all this, because those of us who visited Bangladesh, we know that not everyone is so poverty-stricken as is made out to be over here.
Absolutely. They have a better economic condition than at times what we have nowadays.
Okay, so this is another question from Amardeep Kumar. Can Clause 6 overlap the Citizenship Amendment Act? This has been a topic of discussion since the last.
The two. I see. It's a very difficult question, because not that I cannot answer it, but when you're trying to talk in terms of clause,
this is an academic session. We cannot give any political answer from this platform. This is our compulsion.
True. True.
So
I don't think. I think we need to have a separate discussion on that.
Yeah, we need to have a separate discussion from a separate platform, different platform. From this platform, we cannot go deep into the political interpretation of this.
You need a media platform, Republic.
Yeah, the media platform.
Okay, so let us take another question. This is from Moshumi Chaudhary. Whether there are deporters among the Khasis and Jaintiyas who were the partition-induced, displaced, and refugees?
I want to at some point. I really didn't, but there is a breakup that I have of the people who are in the camps. I don't think we have any Khasi or Jaintia. We do have some Karbis. We have some indigenous communities also figuring in the camps. But surely not Khasi and Jaintia. No. Insofar as, all this entire statistics has been laid before the Supreme Court of India. It is definitely part of an affidavit that has been submitted to the Supreme Court. And it is from the Supreme Court that we get to know the actual, camp-wise breakup of the people who are there in the camp. And from reading of the names, I have read the names of the people who are there in these different camps. I have not found the name of any Khasi or Jaintia people in the detention camps.
Connection problem. Okay. Okay, sir. Thank you. And so as of now, we don't have any more questions in the comment section.
Thank God.
So it's over to Shorupa Madam. Yeah, Madam is having some connection. So Madam, you can come.
They are having some connection problem. So, I think we are having a very beautiful session, and I'm really thankful to all the participants for sharing comments and motivating us with your with your beautiful comments. So I would like to extend my thanks to all the resource persons present here. I think another question was there. Devashish, I think Mr. Chakraborty, are you there? Some question actually in the first session it was already put. Yes, Ashim Rai, a question was put by Sri Ashim Rai. A group of cookies believe a group of cookies believe they are the ancient tribe of Jews. What is your take on it? Can we take this question? Actually,
Yes.
These are myths.
It's a very
Myths.
difficult question, but in a Mizoram, some samples were found where the maternal side, the mitochondrial DNA side, they found that it is from the West Eurasian type. Very few amounts. So it belongs to, I cannot remember whether it's a cookie, but might be related with that, but maybe a diffusion on the maternal side. It gives some idea that there is some migration. There was some migration, including from during the just after the invasion of Alexander the Great. After Alexander the Great, the migration occurred through the Himalayas, and they not even encountered in the main plains. So it gives some hint that there might be some West Eurasian. I am not sure whether it is a Jews, but it's a West Eurasian mitochondrial or maternal links is already there. They found in some Mizo people.
okay, thank you very much. There is another, I think another question is from Dipshika Bhattacharya. India actually has less time to deal with immigration as it has to give more importance to immigration, but both are misgoverned areas. Your views?
We have, in the last 74 years, we are only talking about immigration. I don't think we have less time. I think we have ample amount of time, and we are willing, as a political class, we are willing to give more time to immigration than anything else.
Yes. So I think we have already taken a lot of questions, and I think the participants are also satisfied with the very learned answers from the learned people, and I extend my heartfelt thanks to all the participants for having such a beautiful interactive session. I am again thankful to Dr. Binayak Datta sir and Patricia Mukhi ma'am. So with this we are in the end of this second session, and we'll be back on 3 p.m. with the third session of the seminar of the national webinar with Patricia and Mukhi ma'am. Till then, have a good day and thank you.
Ma'am, just one small, ma'am, just one question. Just
Yes.
one question.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
How do we join Ma'am Patricia Mukhim's lecture? By our own?
Yeah. No, by clicking Patricia Mukhi ma'am's link.
Okay.
We have
Great.
3 links. Yeah, so
Okay,
it is
okay,
our lecture,
okay.
so we have to join through her link.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you
Thank you so much. Thank you
We
so
will be
much.
meeting again at 3 p.m. Thank you very much. Have a
Thank
wonderful day.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.